The security guard at Sterling Financial barely looked up as I walked through the marble lobby at 6 a.m., my heels clicking against the polished floor. 3 years ago, I couldn't even get past the receptionist here. Now I own the building. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Victoria Chen, and I'm about to tell you how my sister's cruel words became the fuel that turned me into a multimillionaire. But first, let me take you back to where it all started, in a cramped studio apartment in downtown Portland, where dreams went to die. The eviction notice was taped to my door like a scarlet letter. 30 days. That's all I had left before I'd be living in my beat-up Honda Civic again. I peeled the orange paper off slowly, my hands trembling not from the October cold, but from the crushing weight of another failure. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister Natalie. Heard about the eviction. Maybe it's time to face reality, Vic. You'll never amount to anything. Those 7 words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were surprising. Natalie had been saying variations of this my entire life. But because for the first time, I was starting to believe her. I pushed open my apartment door and surveyed the chaos inside. Cardboard boxes filled with rejected business plans lined the walls like monuments to my failures. The marketing agency that lasted 6 months. The food truck venture that ended when I couldn't afford insurance. The handmade jewelry business that never sold a single piece. Each failure had cost me money I didn't have, borrowed from credit cards that were now maxed out. My laptop sat on the card table that served as my dining room table, kitchen counter, and office desk. The screen displayed yet another rejection, email from a potential investor. "We don't see the market viability for your concept," it read. Professionals speak for, "This is garbage." I collapsed into the folding chair, my only furniture besides the air mattress in the corner, and stared at my reflection in the blank laptop screen. At 28, I looked older. The stress of constant financial worry had carved lines around my eyes that makeup couldn't hide anymore. My dark hair needed a cut I couldn't afford, and the business suit I'd bought at Goodwill for investor meetings hung loose on my shrinking frame. The contrast with Natalie couldn't have been starker. My sister lived in a pristine 2-bedroom condo in the Pearl District, drove a BMW, and worked as senior marketing director at Meridian Consulting Group, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. While I scrounged for ramen money, she posted Instagram photos of weekend trips to Napa Valley and expensive dinners at restaurants I couldn't even pronounce. We hadn't always been so different. Growing up in our parents' modest house in Beaverton, we'd been close. Nat was 3 years older, and I'd followed her everywhere, desperate to keep up with my brilliant big sister who seemed to excel at everything effortlessly. She'd been valedictorian, prom queen, student body president. I'd been the quiet one with the big dreams and mediocre grades. The divide started in college. While Nat sailed through Oregon State with a business degree and immediately landed a corporate job, I bounced between majors at Portland Community College, never quite finding my path. Our parents, practical people who valued stability above all else, had been supportive but worried. "Victoria needs to be more realistic," I'd overheard Mom telling Dad one night. "She can't keep chasing these impossible dreams." But the real wedge between Nat and me had been driven deeper over the past 3 years, with each failed business venture making her more condescending and me more defensive. Family dinners became interrogations about my latest scheme. Holiday gatherings turned into opportunities for Nat to regale everyone with her corporate success stories while I picked at my food in silence. The worst part wasn't her success. I was genuinely happy for her achievements. The worst part was how she seemed to take pleasure in my failures, as if my struggles somehow validated her choices. Every setback I experienced was met with thinly veiled, "I told you so" comments and suggestions that I should get a real job. But I couldn't give up. Something deep inside me refused to accept that Nat was right, that I was destined to be ordinary, that my dreams were just delusions. Even sitting in that depressing apartment with an eviction notice in my hand, I felt that familiar spark of defiance. My phone rang. Mom. Hi, sweetheart. I heard about your apartment. Why don't you come home for a while? Just until you get back on your feet? The offer was tempting. Free room and board, Mom's cooking, the comfort of childhood routines. But I knew what going home meant. It meant admitting defeat. It meant listening to Dad's lectures about financial responsibility and Nat's smug satisfaction at being proven right. Thanks, Mom, but I'm working on something new. I'll figure it out. Victoria, honey, maybe it's time to consider. I have to go, Mom. I'll call you later. I hung up before she could finish the sentence I'd heard a dozen times before. Maybe it's time to consider being realistic. Time to consider that not everyone is meant to be an entrepreneur. Time to consider that Nat had been right all along. But as I sat there in the silence of my failing life, I noticed something strange. For the first time in months, my mind felt clear. The constant noise of trying to please everyone, trying to prove I wasn't a complete failure, trying to maintain some semblance of optimism, it all faded away. What remained was pure, crystalline focus. I opened my laptop and started typing, but not another business plan. Instead, I began researching Meridian Consulting Group, the company where my sister had built her perfect career. I told myself it was idle curiosity, maybe a way to understand her world better. But as I dug deeper into their client lists, revenue, reports, and corporate structure, something else emerged. Meridian was successful, but it wasn't innovative. They were coasting on reputation and long-term client relationships, doing the same types of marketing campaigns they'd been doing for 15 years. Their website looked like it hadn't been updated since 2018. Their social media presence was practically non-existent. For a marketing company, they were remarkably bad at marketing themselves. I spent the next 6 hours falling down a research rabbit hole. I analyzed their competitors, their pricing structure, their employee reviews on Glassdoor. I studied their case studies and found them laughably outdated. These people were charging premium prices for cookie-cutter solutions that any freelancer could deliver for half the cost. By midnight, I had filled 3 notebooks with observations, ideas, and what could only be described as a rough business plan. But this wasn't like my previous ventures. Those had been born from desperation and wishful thinking. This felt different. This felt like I was looking at a problem I could actually solve. The next morning, I walked to the downtown library. My internet had been shut off 2 days earlier, and continued my research. I dove deeper into the consulting industry, studying companies that had disrupted traditional models. I read about firms that had succeeded by offering specialized services, cutting overhead, and using technology to deliver better results faster. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Meridian was vulnerable. They were a dinosaur in an industry that was rapidly evolving, protected only by their reputation and their clients' reluctance to change. But reputations could be challenged, and even the most loyal clients would eventually demand better results. For their money, I started sketching out a different kind of consulting firm, one that specialized in digital transformation for mid-sized businesses, companies too small for Meridian's attention, but too large for basic freelancer services. Instead of the traditional model of endless meetings and bloated project teams, I envisioned lean, agile campaigns driven by data and delivered through technology platforms that most traditional firms were afraid to embrace. The idea consumed me. For 3 days, I barely slept, surviving on library vending machine snacks and an obsession that felt different from anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't the manic enthusiasm that had driven my previous failed ventures. This was calculating, strategic thinking. On Thursday afternoon, my research took an unexpected turn. While digging through public records about Meridian's corporate structure, I discovered something interesting. The company wasn't actually owned by the prestigious founding partners everyone assumed were in charge. It was owned by Sterling Financial Group, a holding company that had quietly acquired Meridian 18 months ago. More intriguingly, Sterling Financial had been struggling. Their portfolio of acquired companies wasn't performing well, and according to their SEC filings, they were actively looking to sell off underperforming assets. Meridian might have prestige, but their growth had been stagnant for 3 years, running. I felt something click in my brain, like puzzle pieces falling into place. Meridian wasn't just vulnerable to competition, they might be vulnerable to acquisition. And if Sterling Financial was motivated to sell, that opened up possibilities I hadn't even considered. But I was getting ahead of myself. I had $23 in my checking account and a credit score that made loan officers laugh. The idea of acquiring anything beyond a cup of coffee was pure fantasy. Or was it? That evening, I walked home from the library as the Portland rain started its familiar drizzle. The eviction notice was still taped to my door, but I looked at it differently now. Instead of a symbol of failure, it felt like a countdown timer. I had 26 days left to figure out how to turn my research into reality. My phone buzzed, with another text from Nat. "Mom told me you turned down their offer to move home. Pride comes before the fall, Vic. Don't say I didn't warn you." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Thanks for the concern. I'm working on something that's going to change everything." Her response came immediately. "Sure. You are. Can't wait for this one to crash and burn like all the others." I turned off my phone without responding. For the first time in years, Nat's cruelty didn't sting. Instead, it fueled something cold and focused inside me. She thought she knew who I was, thought she had me figured out as the family failure who would never amount to anything. She had no idea what she'd unleashed. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I spent that night creating what I privately called Project Meridian, not a business plan to compete with them, but a comprehensive strategy to eventually acquire them. It was audacious to the point of being delusional, but every number I ran, every scenario I analyzed, kept pointing to the same conclusion. It was possible, not easy. Not probable, but it is possible. The key was thinking bigger than Nat could imagine. While she climbed the corporate ladder one rung at a time, I would build something that could eventually buy the entire ladder. While she focused on impressing her bosses with quarterly results, I would focus on creating something valuable enough to attract the kind of investors who could make impossible dreams possible. But first, I needed to prove that my consulting concept could work. I needed clients, results, and credibility. I needed to build something real before I could even think about acquisitions and revenge fantasies. The next morning, I made a decision that would have terrified me a week earlier. I used my last credit card to buy a month of premium access to business databases and professional networking platforms. If I was going down, I was going down swinging. I started reaching out to mid-sized businesses in Portland, offering free consultations on digital marketing strategy, not because I was desperate, though I was, but because I wanted to test my theories about what these companies really needed versus what they were getting from traditional consulting firms. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Company. After company told me the same story, they were paying premium prices for generic solutions that didn't move the needle. They wanted results, not presentations. They wanted partners who understood their business, not consultants who treated them like another billable hour. Within a week, I had conducted 12 consultations and received 3 requests for proposals. More importantly, I had validation that my instincts about the market were correct. There was a massive gap between what traditional consulting firms were offering and what growing companies actually needed. But I still had the small problem of not having an actual company, an office, or any employees besides myself. And the eviction notice was still taped to my door, now showing 18 days remaining. That's when I met Marcus Rivera. I was sitting in a coffee shop in the Alberta district, working on a proposal for a local restaurant chain, when I overheard a conversation. At the next table, two men were discussing their frustration with their current marketing firm, which happened to be Meridian Consulting Group. They charged us $40,000 for a campaign that generated exactly 0 new customers, one was saying. I swear they just recycled the same presentation they gave us last year. I couldn't help myself. I turned around and introduced myself. Marcus Rivera was the co-owner of Rivera Construction, a family business that had grown from his grandfather's one-man operation into a regional contractor with 50 employees and $12 million in annual revenue. His partner and brother Carlos had been pushing to modernize their marketing efforts, but their experience with Meridian had left them skeptical of consulting firms in general. "What makes you different?" Marcus asked after I'd given him my pitch. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. What made me different? I didn't have Meridian's reputation or resources. I didn't have an office or a team. All I had was hunger, research, and a growing conviction that I understood something about the market that the established players were missing. "I'm not different yet," I told him honestly. "But I will be, because I'm going to prove that results matter more than reputation, and value matters more than prestige. Give me 30 days to show you what's possible, and if I don't deliver measurable improvements to your lead generation, you don't pay me a cent." It was a risky proposition. I was essentially offering to work for free with no guarantee of payment. But I needed proof of concept more than I needed money, and Marcus's willingness to take a chance on an unknown consultant would become the foundation of everything that followed. 3 days later, I was sitting in Rivera Construction's modest office in Southeast Portland, surrounded by blueprints and construction schedules, building the first real consulting engagement of my career. And for the first time since receiving that eviction notice, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. But hope, I was about to learn, was just the beginning. The real work was about to start, and my sister had no idea that her dismissive words had set in motion a chain of events that would eventually put her precious corporate world directly in my crosshairs. The countdown clock was ticking, and I had everything to prove and nothing left to lose. The Rivera Construction campaign launched on a Tuesday morning in November. I'd spent 2 weeks building what I called a digital ecosystem for their business: integrated social media advertising, search engine optimization, content marketing, and a completely redesigned website that actually converted visitors into leads. Marcus had given me a basement office in their building, which consisted of a folding table, a space heater that barely worked, and the constant sound of power tools from the workshop above. It wasn't glamorous, but it was free, and more importantly, it was mine. The first week's results were promising. Website traffic increased by 340%, and they received more qualified leads than they'd seen in the previous 3 months combined. But I knew that initial momentum was just the beginning. The real test would be sustained growth and actual revenue impact. While I monitored campaign metrics obsessively, I kept researching Meridian and Sterling Financial. What I discovered made my acquisition strategy seem less like a fantasy and more like an inevitable outcome if I could execute it correctly. Sterling Financial wasn't just struggling, they were hemorrhaging money. Their quarterly reports showed a pattern of buying established companies at premium prices, then watching those companies stagnate under bureaucratic management. Meridian was actually one of their better performing assets, which said more about Sterling's poor decision-making than Meridian's excellence. More intriguingly, I found connections I hadn't expected. Sterling's CEO, David Park, had a history of buying companies, extracting short-term value, and then selling them off when growth plateaued. His pattern was predictable: acquire, optimize for quarterly profits, lose long-term competitiveness, then sell to the highest bidder. Meridian was entering the final phase of that cycle. But I was still one person working out of a basement, barely able to pay for my own groceries. The gap between my current reality and acquiring a multi-million-dollar company was so vast it seemed absurd. That's when I realized I needed to think differently about the entire problem. Instead of trying to build a company large enough to acquire Meridian directly, I needed to build something valuable enough to attract investors who could facilitate that acquisition. I needed to create a consulting firm so innovative, so successful, and so disruptive to the traditional model that it would become an acquisition target itself, by someone with the resources to then acquire Meridian. The strategy was complex, but it had a beautiful symmetry. I would build something so threatening to Meridian's business model that Sterling Financial would eventually want to buy me to eliminate the competition. Then, from inside their corporate structure, I could orchestrate the changes needed to eventually control the entire company. It was a long-term play that required patience, strategic thinking, and flawless execution. Everything my sister thought I was incapable of. The Rivera results continued to exceed expectations. By the end of the second week, their lead quality had improved so dramatically that they had to hire 2 additional sales staff to handle the I. Marcus was ecstatic, but more importantly, he was talking. Word was spreading through Portland's business community about the unknown consultant who was delivering results that established firms couldn't match. My phone started ringing, not with desperate cold calls, but with referrals from satisfied clients who had heard about Rivera's transformation. A boutique hotel wanted to discuss their digital presence. A local manufacturing company needed help with B2B lead generation. A restaurant group was looking for someone to revamp their entire marketing strategy. Within a month, I had 6 active clients and a waiting list of potential projects. The demand was so strong that I faced a problem I'd never encountered before. I had more work than I could handle alone. That's when I made a decision that would define the next phase of my business. Instead of hiring employees in the traditional sense, I created a network of specialized freelancers, each expert in their specific area, all working under comprehensive project management systems I'd developed. The model was revolutionary for our market. While Meridian charged clients for large project teams and countless meetings, I delivered better results with lean, focused teams that collaborated virtually and measured success by outcomes, not hours billed. My overhead was a fraction of theirs, which allowed me to offer competitive pricing while maintaining higher profit margins. But the real innovation was in the technology infrastructure. I built proprietary software tools that automated much of the routine work that traditional consulting firms charged premium rates to perform manually. Data analysis that took Meridian's teams weeks to complete, I could deliver in hours. Campaign optimization that required their consultants to schedule multiple client meetings, my systems could handle automatically. The competitive advantage was becoming clear, and so was the threat to established players like Meridian. I was working 16-hour days, but for the first time in my adult life, the work felt effortless. Every challenge was a puzzle to solve rather than an obstacle to endure. Every client's success felt like validation of a vision that had been building in my mind for years without me realizing it. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. Within 3 months, I went from having $23 in my checking account to generating more monthly revenue than I'd made in entire years from my previous ventures. I paid off my credit cards, moved into a proper apartment, and began building the cash reserves needed for the next phase of my plan. But success brought unexpected complications. The more visible my company became, the more attention it attracted. From competitors who had initially dismissed me as another freelancer trying to play in their league. The first warning shot came in February. One of my clients, the boutique hotel, called to inform me that they'd received a call from Meridian Consulting Group offering to review and optimize the campaign I'd built for them. The offer came with thinly veiled suggestions that my work might not meet industry standards and that my lack of institutional experience could be putting their brand at risk. It was a transparent attempt at client poaching, but it also revealed something important. Meridian saw me as enough of a threat to warrant direct competitive action. After years of ignoring small firms and freelancers, they were now actively trying to undermine my relationships. I should have felt intimidated. Instead, I felt energized. They wouldn't waste resources fighting someone they didn't consider a real threat. Their attention was confirmation that my strategy was working. The hotel declined Meridian's offer, but the incident made me realize I needed to accelerate my growth plans. If established firms were going to start targeting my clients directly, I needed to build defenses that would make such attacks futile. I used the next month to develop what I called client partnership protocols, comprehensive service packages that went far beyond traditional consulting relationships. Instead of delivering projects and moving on, I created ongoing partnerships where my success was directly tied to my clients' long-term growth. The approach was resource-intensive, but it created competitive moats that would be difficult for larger firms to replicate. While they optimized for billable hours, I optimized for client outcomes. While they focused on project completion, I focused on sustainable business transformation. The strategy worked. Not only did my existing clients become more loyal, but they became active advocates who referred to new business faster than I could accommodate it. By spring, I had 15 active clients, annual revenue approaching 7 figures, and a reputation in Portland's business community that was beginning to overshadow some established firms. That's when I received an unexpected phone call. Victoria. Chen? This is Jennifer Walsh from Pacific Northwest Business Journal. We're doing a feature on emerging consulting firms, and your name keeps coming up in our interviews. Would you be interested in participating? The article, published in May, was titled, "The Disruption Consulting: How One Woman is Rewriting the Rules of Business Advisory Services." It featured a full-page profile with photos of my office, which by then had expanded beyond Marcus's basement, into a proper suite in the Pearl District, and detailed case studies of client transformations I'd facilitated. But the most important paragraph was buried in the middle of the article. Chen's approach represents a fundamental challenge to traditional consulting models. While established firms like Meridian Consulting Group focus on comprehensive service offerings for large corporate clients, Chen's lean methodology and technology-driven solutions are proving that superior results can be achieved with a fraction of the overhead and complexity. The article positioned me as the innovative disruptor and Meridian as the entrenched incumbent, exactly the narrative I needed to build for the next phase of my strategy. The response was immediate. My phone didn't stop ringing for 2 weeks. Clients from Seattle, San Francisco, and even Los Angeles wanted to discuss how my methodology could be applied to their businesses. Investors who had never heard of me suddenly wanted meetings to discuss funding expansion. More intriguingly, I received a call from a headhunter representing Sterling Financial Group. "Ms. Chen, my client is very impressed with your recent success and would like to discuss potential opportunities for collaboration. Would you be available for a confidential conversation about your growth plans?" I scheduled the meeting for the following week, knowing that Sterling's interest was both an opportunity and a validation of everything I'd been building toward. They were beginning to see me as either a potential acquisition or a threat to their existing portfolio companies. Either way, I was entering their sphere of attention, which put me one step closer to Meridian and one step closer to proving my sister wrong in the most dramatic way possible. But first, I needed to understand exactly what Sterling Financial wanted and how I could use their interests to advance my own agenda. The game was becoming more complex, but the stakes were also becoming higher. I spent the weekend before the Sterling meeting preparing for every possible scenario. They might want to acquire my company. They might want to offer partnership opportunities. They might even want to offer me a position within their existing corporate structure. What they definitely wouldn't expect was a consultant who had spent months studying their business model, analyzing their weaknesses, and developing a strategy. to eventually control their most prestigious asset. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning at Sterling's offices in downtown Portland. As I rode the elevator to the 40th floor, I couldn't help but think about the contrast with my sister's situation. While Nat was focused on climbing the corporate ladder at Meridian, I was about to have a strategic conversation with the people who actually owned her company. She still had no idea that her dismissive little sister had built something significant. Our family interactions had been minimal since I'd started my business. A few awkward text exchanges and one brief appearance at a family barbecue where I'd deflected questions about my work with vague references to consulting projects. Let her think I was still the struggling entrepreneur she'd always known. The revelation would be so much sweeter when it came from a position of undeniable strength. The Sterling financial offices were everything I expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, expensive modern furniture, and the kind of understated luxury that screamed corporate success. David Park's assistant led me to a conference room where 3 executives were waiting. Park himself was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of polished confidence that came from years of successful deals. The other 2 introduced themselves as the head of corporate development and their chief financial officer. Ms. Chen, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We've been following your company's development with great interest. What followed was one of the most important conversations of my business career, though they had no idea how important it would ultimately become. They asked detailed questions about my methodology, my client base, my growth projections, and my long-term strategic vision. I answered carefully, sharing enough information to demonstrate the strength of my business model while keeping proprietary details protected. But I was also listening intently to what they weren't saying directly. Their concerns about traditional consulting models, their frustration with the performance of their existing portfolio companies, and their interest in innovative approaches to service delivery. After an hour of discussion, Park leaned back in his chair and got to the real purpose of the meeting. Victoria, we think there could be significant synergies between your approach and our existing consulting assets. We'd like to explore the possibility of bringing your company into our portfolio, with you continuing to lead operations while benefiting from our resources and market access. It was exactly the conversation I'd hoped for, but much sooner than I'd expected. They were essentially offering to buy my company, which would give me the resources to compete directly with Meridian while positioning me within Sterling's corporate structure. But I needed to be careful. Accepting their offer too quickly would seem desperate, and I needed to maintain leverage for the longer-term strategy I was developing. That's an intriguing possibility, I said carefully. But I'd need to understand more about how such a partnership would work in practice. My company's success is built on agility and innovation. Those qualities don't always translate well within larger corporate structures. Park nodded. We're aware of that challenge. That's why we'd want you to maintain operational independence while having access to our capital and corporate relationships. Think of it as a strategic partnership rather than a traditional acquisition. We discussed preliminary terms for another 30 minutes, but I could see they were serious about moving forward. More importantly, I could see they were motivated by genuine concern about the competitive threats facing their existing consulting assets. They were worried about companies exactly like mine. Companies that could deliver better results with lower overhead. Companies that understood how technology could disrupt traditional service models. Companies that were attracting the kind of clients that Meridian had taken for granted for decades. Agreed to consider their proposal and provide a formal response within 2 weeks. As I left their offices, I felt a familiar surge of strategic excitement. The pieces of my larger plan were starting to align faster than I'd dared hope, but I also realized that the next phase would require even more careful planning. Once I became part of Sterling's portfolio, I would be operating within their corporate ecosystem, which meant I'd have access to information about all their companies, including detailed intelligence about Meridian's operations, challenges, and vulnerabilities. The game was entering a new level of complexity, and my sister still had no idea that the rules had changed completely. The Sterling Financial deal closed on a Thursday in September, exactly 11 months after that eviction. Notice had been taped to my apartment door. The acquisition price was $2.8 million, enough to make me wealthy by any reasonable standard, but more importantly, it gave me the resources and positioning I needed for the next phase of my strategy. What Sterling's executives didn't realize was that they had just handed me the keys to their entire consulting portfolio, including detailed financial data, operational metrics, and strategic plans for every company they owned, including Meridian. My first official day as a Sterling portfolio CEO was surreal. I walked into the same downtown building where I'd met with David Park months earlier, but now I had badge access, a corner office on the 38th floor, and a direct reporting relationship to Sterling's corporate development team. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my sister was still grinding away at Meridian, trying to impress bosses who were ultimately accountable to Sterling Financial, I was now part of Sterling's senior leadership team with access to information that could reshape the entire consulting landscape. But I forced myself to think strategically rather than emotionally. Gloating about my position relative to Natalie's would be satisfying but counterproductive. My real goal wasn't just to surpass her professionally, it was to fundamentally transform the industry she thought she understood. The first Sterling board meeting I attended was a masterclass in corporate dysfunction. David Park presented quarterly, results that looked impressive on surface-level metrics, but revealed deeper structural problems when you analyzed them carefully. Revenue was growing, but profit margins were shrinking. Client acquisition costs were increasing, while client retention rates were declining. Most concerning, their portfolio companies were losing market share to newer, more agile competitors, companies exactly like the one I'd just built. When Park asked for strategic input from portfolio CEOs, I was ready. The traditional consulting model is experiencing systematic disruption, I began, clicking through a presentation I'd prepared meticulously. Client expectations are shifting toward outcome-based services, rapid implementation, and technology-enabled solutions. Our current portfolio is optimized for a market that's rapidly disappearing. I spent 15 minutes outlining the competitive threats facing Sterling's consulting assets, using anonymous data from my own client wins against Meridian and similar firms. The presentation was devastating in its implications. Sterling was losing money on prestigious companies that were becoming increasingly irrelevant. "What do you recommend?" asked the CFO, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be comfortable. "Portfolio consolidation and strategic repositioning," I said calmly. "We need to combine our consulting assets into a single technology-driven entity that can compete effectively in the emerging market. The alternative is watching them die slowly while newer companies capture their market share." The room was silent for several moments. Finally, Park leaned forward. "You're talking about essentially dismantling Meridian and our other traditional consulting companies." "I'm talking about transforming them before the market does it for us," I replied. "Meridian has brand recognition and client relationships that are valuable, but their operational model and service delivery methods are becoming obsolete. We can preserve what's valuable while rebuilding what isn't working." It was a calculated gamble. I was essentially proposing to cannibalize Sterling's most prestigious asset in order to create something more competitive. But I was also positioning myself as the logical leader for such a transformation, given my demonstrated success with innovative consulting models. The meeting ended with Park agreeing to commission a comprehensive analysis of Sterling's consulting portfolio, with me leading the research team. It was exactly the outcome I'd hoped for: legitimate corporate authority to dissect Meridian's operations and develop a transformation strategy. Over the next 6 weeks, I gained access to information that most corporate executives never see about their competitors: financial statements, client contracts, employee performance reviews, operational metrics, strategic planning documents, everything needed to understand exactly how Meridian operated and where it was vulnerable. What I discovered exceeded my expectations for how comprehensively the company was failing to adapt to market changes. Meridian's client satisfaction scores had been declining for 3 consecutive years, but management had dismissed the trend as temporary market turbulence. Their largest clients were increasingly questioning the value they received for premium fees, and several major contracts were unlikely to renew. Most damaging, their employee retention rate was abysmal. They were losing their best consultants to smaller firms that offered more flexibility and better compensation structures. But the most revealing discovery was in their new business development data. Meridian was losing competitive bids at an accelerating rate, almost always to companies that could deliver comparable results faster and cheaper, companies with business models very similar to what I'd developed. The analysis took on additional urgency when I learned that Meridian was actively pursuing several clients I'd been targeting for expansion. They weren't just competing with me theoretically, they were directly attempting to prevent my growth by outbidding me for the specific opportunities that would allow me to scale nationally. It was a high-stakes game of corporate chess, and my sister was one of the key players trying to block my moves. The personal dimension added intensity to what was already a crucial business battle. But I had advantages Meridian couldn't match. Through Sterling's corporate development resources, I could access intelligence about client decision-making processes, budget constraints, and evaluation criteria that would normally take months of relationship building to obtain. I could also leverage Sterling's financial backing to submit proposals that undercut Meridian's pricing while maintaining healthy margins for my own operations. The competitive dynamics shifted in my favor almost immediately. In November, I won 3 major client engagements that Meridian had expected to secure, including a Fortune 500 manufacturing company that represented the largest single contract in my company's history. The manufacturing deal was particularly significant because it validated my approach at the enterprise level. If I could deliver transformational results for a Fortune 500 client, it would establish credibility that would open doors throughout the corporate market. More importantly, it would demonstrate that my methodology could scale to handle the kind of complex, multi-divisional challenges that had traditionally been Meridian's specialty. But success at that scale required expanding my team beyond the freelancer network that had worked for smaller clients. I needed full-time employees with specialized expertise, which meant competing directly with Meridian for consulting talent. The recruitment campaign I launched was surgical in its targeting. Instead of posting generic job listings, I identified specific Meridian employees who had the skills I needed and whose professional development had been stagnating under their current management. I reached out through LinkedIn and industry networks, offering not just higher salaries, but equity, positions, and leadership opportunities they couldn't access at traditional firms. The response was overwhelming. Within a month, I had recruited 12 former Meridian employees, including 2 senior directors who brought client relationships and institutional knowledge that would have taken years to develop independently. The defections created chaos within Meridian's operations. Losing 12 employees in 4 weeks forced them to reorganize project teams, delay client deliverables, and scramble to prevent additional departures. More importantly, it sent a signal throughout the industry that Meridian was vulnerable and that talented consultants had better options available. One of my new hires was particularly valuable. Sarah Martinez, who had been Meridian's head of business development before becoming frustrated with their reluctance to innovate. Sarah brought detailed knowledge of Meridian's client pipeline, competitive strategies, and internal politics, including insights about my sister's role within the organization. "Natalie's actually quite talented," Sarah told me during her first week, "but she's completely bought into Meridian's traditional approach. She genuinely believes that established methods are inherently superior to innovation. It makes her effective at maintaining existing client relationships, but blind to emerging threats." It was a perfect summary of everything I'd observed about my sister throughout our lives. She excelled at working within existing systems, but couldn't imagine that those systems might need to change. Her strength within traditional corporate structures was also her greatest vulnerability in a rapidly evolving market. The manufacturing client engagement launched in January, and from the beginning, it was clear that this project would define the next phase of my company's development. The scope was enormous: digital transformation across 4 business units, marketing automation for a global sales organization, and operational optimization for supply chain management. Traditional consulting firms would have assigned 40 or 50 people to such a project, with timelines extending over 18 months. My approach was to use advanced project management systems and specialized technology tools to deliver the same outcomes with a team of 15 people in 8 months. The client was skeptical initially. Their previous experience with large consulting firms had conditioned them to expect armies of analysts and endless rounds of meetings. My lean approach seemed almost negligent by comparison, but results spoke louder than methodology. Within 6 weeks, we had implemented marketing automation systems that increased their lead generation by 200%. By month 3, supply chain optimizations were saving them $50,000 monthly in operational costs. At the halfway point, our digital transformation initiatives had improved their customer acquisition rates by 35% while reducing sales cycle times by half. The success was generating attention throughout the corporate consulting market, but it was also creating a problem I hadn't fully anticipated. As my company's reputation grew, we were increasingly competing not just with Meridian, but with the entire traditional consulting industry. Major firms were beginning to view us as a systemic threat rather than a niche player. The counterattack came in March, coordinated across multiple fronts simultaneously. First, 3 of our largest clients received unsolicited calls from senior partners at established consulting firms, offering to audit our work for potential compliance issues. The calls were thinly veiled attempts to plant doubt about our capabilities and create pressure for more traditional approaches. Second, industry publications began running articles questioning whether disruptive consulting models could maintain quality standards when scaling to enterprise clients. The articles didn't mention my company by name, but the timing and specific criticisms were clearly targeted. Third, several of our key employees received recruitment offers from competing firms, offers that were structured to make departure extremely attractive, while also requiring non-compete agreements that would prevent them from working for us or similar companies. It was a sophisticated campaign designed to undermine our credibility, destabilize our operations, and limit our ability to compete for major clients. The kind of coordinated response that only happened when established players felt genuinely threatened. But what the traditional firms didn't realize was that their attacks were validation of everything I'd been building toward. They were acknowledging that my approach was fundamentally superior to theirs, and that market forces were shifting in ways they couldn't control through traditional competitive methods. More importantly, their aggressive tactics were creating opportunities for the final phase of my strategy. Sterling Financial was watching their consulting assets lose market share to companies like mine, while also observing the industry-wide response to our success. The logical conclusion was becoming impossible to ignore. Sterling needed to transform their consulting portfolio before it became completely obsolete. When David Park called to schedule an urgent meeting about strategic realignment, I knew the conversation would determine whether my long-term plan was achievable. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, but I already knew what he was going to propose. The only question was whether the terms would allow me to complete what I'd started, not just building a successful company, but fundamentally reshaping an entire industry. And somewhere in Meridian's offices, my sister was still focused on climbing a corporate ladder that was about to be completely reconstructed around her. She had no idea that the little sister she'd always dismissed was about to become her boss. David Park's office felt different this time. The same floor-to-ceiling windows, the same expensive furniture, but the power dynamics had shifted completely. I was no longer the desperate entrepreneur seeking opportunity. I was Sterling's most successful portfolio CEO, sitting across from a man whose job performance increasingly depended on my strategic recommendations. Victoria, we need to talk about accelerating the consulting portfolio consolidation. Park began without preamble. Our Q1 numbers are worse than projected, and the board is asking difficult questions about our traditional assets. I had prepared for this moment for months, but hearing him say it still sent a surge of adrenaline through my system. Sterling Financial was ready to implement the radical restructuring that would put Meridian directly under my control. What timeline are we discussing? I asked, keeping my voice professionally neutral while my mind raced through the implications. The board wants a comprehensive transformation plan within 60 days, with implementation beginning immediately after approval. We're talking about complete operational integration, systems, personnel, client relationships, everything. Everything. Including my sister's career, her sense of professional identity, and her understanding of where she stood in the industry hierarchy. But I couldn't think about the personal dimension yet. This conversation was about corporate strategy, and any emotional considerations would have to wait. That's an aggressive timeline, I said carefully. Successful integration requires managing client transitions, retaining key talent, and maintaining service quality during operational disruption. Rushing the process could damage the very assets we're trying to optimize. Park leaned forward. What would you need to make it work? It was the question I'd been waiting for. The opportunity to set terms that would give me not just operational control over Meridian, but the resources to transform the entire consulting industry according to my vision. Complete authority over personnel decisions, including executive-level changes. Dedicated budget for technology infrastructure upgrades. And guarantee that integration decisions won't be second-guessed by corporate committees that don't understand the operational complexities. Done, Park said without hesitation. The board has already approved whatever resources you need. They want results, not process management. The next 6 weeks were a blur of corporate warfare disguised as business integration. I assembled a team of specialists, organizational psychologists, technology architects, client relationship experts, to design a transformation that would be swift, comprehensive, and irreversible. But first, I needed intelligence about Meridians. Internal dynamics, client vulnerabilities, and employee loyalty patterns. Sarah Martinez became my primary source, using her relationships within the company to gather information that would be crucial for managing the transition. There's significant dissatisfaction with current management, Sarah reported during one of our weekly briefings. Morale has been declining for months, especially after they lost several major clients to competitors. People are questioning whether the leadership understands how rapidly the market is changing. What about client relationships? How stable are they? More fragile than management realizes. I've heard from former colleagues that at least 6 major clients have been exploring alternatives. They're staying with Meridian mostly out of inertia, not satisfaction. This information was crucial for timing the integration announcement. If we moved too quickly, we risked triggering client defections before we could demonstrate improved capabilities. But if we moved too slowly, competitors might capitalize on Meridian's current instability to poach their most valuable relationships. Decided on a hybrid approach, selective early disclosure to Meridian's most secure clients, combined with accelerated capability demonstrations that would showcase the benefits of integration before concerns could develop. The strategy required perfect execution, but it also created an opportunity to address the personal dimension of this transformation. I would have to work directly with Natalie as we integrated the 2 companies, which meant revealing my role in Meridian's acquisition while managing the professional relationship necessary for smooth operations. I hadn't spoken to my sister in over 6 months. Our last interaction had been a brief text exchange where she'd asked about my little consulting business, and I'd deflected with vague responses about steady growth. She had no idea that her little sister's company had become valuable enough to attract acquisition by Sterling Financial, or that I was now positioned to reshape her entire professional world. The integration announcement was scheduled for a Monday morning in May. Sterling would inform all portfolio companies simultaneously, with detailed transition plans distributed to management teams and key employees. I would personally deliver the news to Meridian's senior staff, including Natalie. The weekend before the announcement, I finally called my parents. "Victoria, we were just talking about you," Mom said, her voice bright with surprise. "How's the consulting work going?" "Actually, that's why I'm calling. There are going to be some changes at work that might affect our family dynamics. I wanted you to hear it from me first." "What kind of changes, sweetheart?" I took a deep breath. "My company was acquired by a larger firm a few months ago. Tomorrow we're announcing that I'll be leading the integration of several consulting companies, including the one where Natalie works." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Including Meridian?" Mom finally asked. "Yes. I'll essentially be taking over operational leadership of Meridian as part of a larger corporate restructuring. Natalie will be reporting to me, at least temporarily during the transition." "Oh my," Mom whispered. "How is Natalie going to handle this?" It was the question I'd been avoiding thinking about directly. Natalie's entire professional identity was built around her success within traditional corporate structures. Having her previously unsuccessful sister suddenly become her boss would challenge everything she believed about merit, success, and the natural order of professional hierarchies. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I hope she'll see it as an opportunity, rather than a threat. The integration will create advancement possibilities that wouldn't exist otherwise." After hanging up with Mom, I spent Sunday preparing for what would be one of the most important presentations of my career. Not just because it would determine the success of a major corporate integration, but because it would be the moment when my sister finally understood how completely wrong she'd been about my potential. Monday morning arrived with typical Portland rain, heavy, persistent, and somehow appropriate for the gravity of what was about to happen. I drove to Meridian's offices in the Pearl District, the same building where Natalie had worked for the past 5 years, building what she thought was an unassailable career. The senior staff meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in their main conference room. As I walked through Meridian's lobby, I couldn't help but notice how different it felt from my own company's offices. Everything was designed to project stability and tradition. Marble surfaces, heavy wooden furniture, formal portraits of founding partners. It was exactly the kind of environment that had intimidated me years ago, when I thought success meant conforming to other people's definitions of professionalism. Now it just looked outdated. The conference room was full when I arrived. 15 senior managers and directors, including Natalie, who was seated near the far end of the table reviewing what appeared to be quarterly performance reports. She looked up when I entered, and I saw the exact moment when recognition dawned. Her expression shifted from polite professional attention to confusion to something approaching shock. She knew who I was, obviously, but couldn't immediately process why her sister was walking into her company's senior management meeting carrying a Sterling Financial corporate folder. "Good morning, everyone," I began, moving to the head of the table. "Thank you for accommodating this early meeting. I'm Victoria Chen, CEO of Chen Consulting Group, and I have some important news about Meridian's future." I clicked the first slide of my presentation, Sterling Financial's logo alongside both company names, with strategic integration as the title. As of today, Sterling Financial is implementing a comprehensive consolidation of their consulting portfolio. Meridian Consulting Group will be integrating with Chen Consulting Group under unified leadership and operational systems. The room was completely silent. I could see people processing the implications, some looking concerned, others curious, a few already calculating how this might affect their career prospects. But my attention was focused on Natalie, whose face had gone completely pale. "The integration will begin immediately," I continued, "with full operational transition completed within 90 days. During this period, I'll be serving as Chief Executive Officer for the combined entity, with reporting relationships restructured to optimize service delivery and market competitiveness. I spent the next 30 minutes outlining the integration plan, client transition protocols, employee evaluation processes, technology system upgrades, and organizational restructuring. It was comprehensive, professionally presented, and designed to address every concern that traditional consulting professionals might have about working within a more innovative operational model. But I was also watching Natalie's reaction throughout the presentation. After the initial shock wore off, I could see her analytical mind beginning to process the business implications. She was probably realizing that this integration represented both a threat to her current position and potentially significant opportunities for advancement within a larger, more dynamic organization. When I finished the presentation, the questions came quickly. Timeline concerns, client relationship management, compensation structures, performance evaluation criteria. I answered each question thoroughly, demonstrating that every aspect of the integration had been carefully planned to minimize disruption, while maximizing competitive advantages. Finally, Natalie spoke. Victoria, could you clarify the reporting structure? Will current Meridian management be maintaining their existing responsibilities during the transition? It was the question I'd been expecting, and the one that would define our professional relationship going forward. The reporting structure will be merit-based and performance-oriented, I said, meeting her eyes directly. Current titles and organizational hierarchies are less important than demonstrated capabilities and alignment with our integrated operational model. Everyone will have opportunities to prove their value within the new structure. What I didn't say, but what everyone in the room understood, was that traditional corporate seniority would no longer guarantee position or authority. People would have to earn their roles based on results, rather than tenure. After the meeting ended and people filed out, Natalie approached me. "Can we talk privately?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. I nodded, and we moved to a smaller conference room down the hall. When the door closed, her professional composure finally cracked. "How?" she asked simply. "How did this happen? Last time we talked, you were struggling to keep your business afloat. Now you're taking over my company?" I sat across from her, choosing my words carefully. This conversation would set the tone for our professional relationship during the integration, but it would also determine whether we could salvage any kind of personal relationship as siblings. "I built something valuable," I said quietly. "Something innovative enough to attract acquisition by Sterling Financial, and successful enough that they're trusting me to reshape their entire consulting portfolio. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't an accident. It was strategic execution over the course of 2 years. But you never said anything. All this time, you let me think. I let you think what you chose to think," I interrupted. "You made assumptions about my capabilities based on past failures rather than current results. I didn't have any obligation to correct those assumptions." Natalie stared at me for a long moment. "You planned this, didn't you? You specifically targeted Meridian." It was a perceptive question, and one that forced me to decide how honest I wanted to be about my motivations. "I built a company that was designed to disrupt traditional consulting models," I said carefully. Meridian represented those traditional models. The competitive dynamic was inevitable, regardless of our personal relationship. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're going to get," I replied. "What matters now is whether you can adapt to working within the integrated structure, or whether you'd prefer to explore opportunities elsewhere." The ultimatum was implicit but clear: accept the new reality, or leave. There would be no special consideration because she was my sister, and no accommodation for her discomfort with the changed power dynamics. Natalie was quiet for several minutes, and I could see her processing everything: the professional implications, the personal betrayal she probably felt, and the practical reality that she needed to make a decision about her career. "What would my role be?" she finally asked. That depends on how effectively you can contribute to the integration process and long-term operational success. Your knowledge of Meridian's client relationships and internal processes is valuable, but only if you can apply it constructively rather than defensively. And if I can't adapt? Then you'll need to find a position somewhere that's a better fit for your working style. Sterling will provide excellent references and a generous severance package. It was a fair offer, but also a final one. I wasn't going to spend months managing. Resistance from someone who couldn't accept that the industry had changed, and that I was now positioned to lead that change. Natalie stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Portland skyline. When she turned back, her expression was different, more focused, less emotional. "I want to make this work," she said. "I don't understand how you got here, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable with how you did it. But I respect what you've accomplished. If you're willing to give me a chance to prove I can contribute, I'd like to try." It wasn't the response I'd expected, but it was the one that would make the integration much smoother. More importantly, it suggested that Natalie was capable of growth and adaptation when circumstances required it. "Then let's get to work," I said, standing to shake her hand. "We have 90 days to prove that this integration can transform not just our companies, but the entire consulting industry." As we walked back toward the main office area, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. I had achieved the strategic objective that had seemed impossible 2 years earlier, gaining operational control over Meridian and positioning myself to reshape the industry according to my vision. But I had also fundamentally altered my relationship with my sister in ways that might never be fully resolved. The personal cost of professional success was something I'd have to live with, regardless of how well the business integration proceeded. The real test would come in the following weeks, as we moved from announcement to implementation. Sterling. Financial was betting their consulting portfolio on my ability to deliver results that justified this radical transformation. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear Natalie's voice from 2 years ago. "You'll never amount to anything." Now she would have the opportunity to see exactly how wrong she had been, and to decide whether she could be part of what I was building, or whether she would become another casualty of the changes I was implementing. The integration was about to begin in earnest, and everything we had both worked for was about to change forever. 3 months after the integration announcement, I stood in the conference room of what was now Chen Meridian Strategic Consulting, looking out at a team that had been transformed beyond recognition. The same space where I'd delivered the shocking news of the merger now housed weekly strategy sessions for the most innovative consulting firm on the West Coast. The numbers told the story better than any corporate presentation could. Revenue was up 340% year over year. Client retention had improved to 98%, the highest in the industry. We'd expanded from Portland to Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, with plans for East Coast offices by year-end. Most importantly, we'd proven that the consulting industry could be fundamentally reimagined without sacrificing quality or results. But the most significant transformation wasn't reflected in any financial metric. It was sitting across the table. From me, leading a client presentation with confidence and innovation I'd never seen from her before, Natalie had become one of our most effective senior consultants. The change hadn't happened overnight. The first month of integration had been brutal. Tense meetings, passive-aggressive resistance, and constant testing of boundaries as former Meridian employees adjusted to radically different operational expectations. Several people had left, unable or unwilling to adapt to our performance-driven culture. But those who stayed, including my sister, had experienced professional growth that wouldn't have been possible within traditional corporate structures. The predictive analytics we've implemented for Aurora Manufacturing have reduced their inventory, carrying costs by 23% while improving order fulfillment rates, Natalie was saying, clicking through slides that demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking she'd never been encouraged to develop at traditional Meridian. More importantly, the system learns from each transaction, so performance improvements compound over time. I watched her present to Sterling Financial's board of directors, the same executives who had once viewed her employer as a stagnating asset. Now they were seeing what happened when talented people were given the tools and freedom to innovate, rather than simply maintaining existing processes. "Outstanding results," said David Park when Natalie finished. "This is exactly the kind of transformation we hope to achieve through the integration." After the meeting, as board members filed out discussing expansion budgets and growth targets, Natalie approached me. "Can we talk?" she asked. It had become her standard request after major presentations, part of an ongoing dialogue about strategy and operations that would have been impossible under the old hierarchical structure. We walked to my office, the same space that had once belonged to Meridian's managing partner, now redesigned with open collaboration areas and advanced technology infrastructure that reflected our integrated corporate culture. "I wanted to thank you," Natalie said once we were alone. It wasn't what I'd expected to hear. Over the past 3 months, our interactions had been professional but cautious, both of us navigating the complex dynamics of reversed family roles in a corporate setting. Thank me for what? For not giving up on me during those first few weeks when I was being difficult. I know I was resistant to changes, and there were probably moments when letting me go would have been easier than managing my adjustment period. She was right. There had been several instances early in the integration when Natalie's inability to let go of traditional approaches had created friction with other team members and complicated client projects. I'd considered whether the family relationship was more of a liability than an asset. "You adapted," I said simply. "That's what mattered. But you gave me space to adapt, which wasn't something you owed me professionally or personally." Natalie sat down across from my desk. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation from 2 years ago, when I told you that you'd never amount to anything. I'd wondered when she would bring up those words directly. They'd hung between us throughout the integration process. Never explicitly acknowledged but always present in the background of our rebuilt relationship. I was wrong," she continued. "Not just about your potential, but about what amounting to something actually means. I thought success was about climbing existing ladders and impressing existing gatekeepers. I never considered that real success might mean building new ladders entirely. It was perhaps the closest thing to an apology I was going to get, and honestly, it was more acknowledgement than I'd expected." The woman sitting across from me was fundamentally different from the sister who had dismissed my dreams 2 years earlier. Not because her personality had changed, but because her understanding of what was possible had expanded dramatically. "The industry needed disruption," I said. "I just happened to be in the right position to provide it when circumstances aligned." "That's not true, and you know it." Natalie leaned forward. "You created those circumstances through strategic planning and execution that most people couldn't have managed. You didn't stumble into success. You engineered it." Before I could respond, my assistant knocked on the door. "Victoria, David Park is on line 1. He says it's urgent." I picked up the phone, gesturing for Natalie to stay. "David? What's going on?" "We just received an acquisition offer." Park's voice was tight with excitement. "Blackstone Strategic wants to buy our entire consulting portfolio, including Chen Meridian. The number is significant." "How significant?" $47 million. The number hit me like a physical force. $47 million for a company that had been worth essentially nothing 2 years earlier. It represented validation beyond anything I'd imagined when I was sitting in that studio apartment with an eviction notice. "What's the timeline?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They want a response within 2 weeks. If we accept, the transition would begin immediately, with you maintaining operational control under their corporate structure. It's essentially the same arrangement we have now, but with significantly more resources for expansion." After hanging up, I sat in silence for several moments, processing the implications. The acquisition would make me wealthy beyond any reasonable need. But more importantly, it would provide resources to scale our innovative approach nationally and eventually internationally. Good news? Natalie asked. Potentially life-changing. News. Blackstone Strategic wants to acquire the entire consulting portfolio for $47 million. Natalie's eyes widened. $47 million? For a company that didn't exist 2 years ago? For a company that proved traditional consulting models could be disrupted profitably, I corrected. The acquisition validates everything we've built, but it also creates decisions about what comes next. What came next was a whirlwind of due diligence meetings, legal negotiations, and strategic planning sessions that would determine not just my financial future, but the future of everyone who had joined our transformation of the consulting industry. The Blackstone deal closed on a Friday in November, almost exactly 2 years after my sister had told me I'd never amount to anything. The signing took place in Sterling Financial's conference room, the same space where I'd first pitched my strategy for disrupting the traditional consulting model. But this time, the meeting wasn't just about corporate strategy. My parents had driven up from Beaverton to witness the signing, along with several of my earliest employees and even Marcus Rivera, whose construction company had been my first real client. Ladies and gentlemen, David Park announced after the final signatures, were completed. I'm pleased to officially welcome Chen Meridian Strategic Consulting to the Blackstone Strategic Portfolio. The applause was polite and professional, but I felt a deeper satisfaction that had nothing to do with the financial terms. I'd proven that innovation could triumph over established tradition, that strategic thinking could overcome resource disadvantages, and that someone dismissed as a failure could reshape an entire industry. More importantly, I'd proven it to myself. After the ceremony, as people gathered for champagne and congratulations, Natalie pulled me aside. "I have something for you," she said, handing me a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photo from our childhood, the two of us at ages 8 and 11, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera during a family vacation. But attached to the frame was a handwritten note. "To the sister who taught me that impossible is just another word for, I haven't figured out how yet. Thank you for showing me what determination really looks like." Natalie. I stared at the IE photo, remembering that vacation and how close we'd been before competition and different definitions of success had driven us apart. The woman who had written this note wasn't the same person who had dismissed my dreams, just as I wasn't the same person who had been crushed by her dismissal. "This means more to me than the acquisition," I said, and meant it. "I know. That's why I wanted to give it to you today." The party continued around us, but I found myself thinking about the journey from that eviction notice to this moment. Every failure that had seemed devastating at the time had provided lessons that made eventual success possible. Every moment of doubt had forced me to develop resilience that sustained me through the challenging phases of building something unprecedented. But most importantly, my sister's cruel words had provided the motivation that fueled every strategic decision, every late-night work session, every moment when giving up would have been easier than continuing. She'd told me I'd never amount to anything. Instead, I'd built something that transformed an entire industry. "Victoria," my father approached, pride evident in his expression, "we always knew you had potential, but this is beyond anything we imagined." "Thanks, Dad. Though I have to admit, there were times when I wasn't sure I'd ever figure out how to make it work." "But you did," my mother added, joining our conversation. "And you brought Natalie along with you. That's what makes this really special. You succeeded together." She was right. The Blackstone acquisition wasn't just personal vindication. It was validation of an approach that had transformed not just my life, but the lives of everyone who had been willing to embrace change and innovation over tradition and hierarchy. As the celebration wound down and people began to leave, I found myself alone in the conference room, looking out at the Portland skyline. 2 years ago, this view represented everything I couldn't access: corporate success, financial security, professional recognition. Now it was just the view from my office, familiar and comfortable. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Saw the announcement in the business journal. Congratulations on proving that persistence pays off. Rachel, your old landlord. Even my former landlord had seen the news about the acquisition. The contrast with my situation when she'd served that eviction notice was so dramatic, it felt like reading about someone else's life. But the most meaningful acknowledgement came in a simple email that arrived as I was gathering my things to leave. Vic, I know I've already said this, but I need to say it again. I was wrong about everything. You didn't just amount to something, you amounted to something extraordinary. I'm proud to be your sister, and I'm grateful you gave me the chance to be part of what you built. Nat. I read the message twice, then forwarded it to my personal email so I'd never lose it. Those words meant more than any acquisition price or industry recognition, because they represented genuine understanding from someone whose opinion had shaped my self-perception for most of my life. The story could have ended with resentment and family division. Instead, it had become about transformation and second chances, not just for me, but for everyone willing to embrace change. 6 months later, I was back in Portland for the grand opening of Chen Meridian's new headquarters, a 50,000 square foot facility designed to showcase the future of consulting services. The building featured advanced collaboration technology, flexible workspace configurations, and innovation labs where clients could prototype solutions before implementation. But the most important feature was the conference room where I held monthly all-hands meetings with our now 150 employees. The same room where I delivered presentations to Fortune 500 executives who had once dismissed innovative consulting models as unproven experiments. 2 years ago, I told the assembled team during our latest meeting, this company didn't exist. The approaches we now consider standard practice were viewed as radical experiments. The technology platforms that drive our competitive advantage were untested concepts. I clicked a slide showing our current client list, companies that represented billions in combined revenue, all of whom had chosen our innovative approach over traditional consulting models. But the most important thing we've proven isn't about technology or methodology. We've proven that being told something is impossible is just the starting point for figuring out how to make it possible. After the meeting, Natalie approached me with a proposal. I've been thinking about expansion opportunities, she said. What if we opened an office in New York? I know the East Coast market, and I think there's significant demand for our approach among companies that are frustrated with traditional consulting firms. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made our partnership so effective. Natalie had evolved from someone who defended existing systems to someone who actively looked for opportunities to disrupt them. Put together a business plan, I said. If the numbers work, we'll discuss it with Blackstone. As she walked away, already mentally drafting the proposal, I reflected on how completely our roles had reversed. She was now the one proposing ambitious expansion plans, while I was the established leader evaluating strategic opportunities. But more importantly, we were both contributing to something larger than either of us could have built alone. That evening, I drove past my old apartment building, the one where I'd received the eviction notice that had started this entire journey. The building looked exactly the same, but I felt like I was looking at a museum exhibit from someone else's life. My phone rang as I sat in the parking lot. Natalie. I just wanted to call and say thank you again, she said. Not just for the professional opportunities, but for teaching me what real determination looks like. I never understood it before, but watching you build this company showed me the difference between working hard within existing systems and working strategically to change those systems entirely. You figured it out, I replied. That's what mattered. I figured it out because you showed me it was possible. 2 years ago, when I said you'd never amount to anything, I was really saying that I couldn't imagine a different definition of success. You didn't just prove me wrong. You expanded my understanding of what was possible. After hanging up, I sat in the car for a few more minutes, thinking about the journey from that desperate moment with an eviction notice to this moment of established success and transformed relationships. My sister had told me I'd never amount to anything. She'd been wrong about my potential, but more importantly, she'd been wrong about her own. We'd both become something neither of us had imagined was possible, and that, I realized, was the real victory. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories, ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.